Thanks so much for coming. I have to start by apologizing for the rain. It's just part of the global crises we're going to discuss today, the changes in weather that we all do see. But this is not. I know that when you see the term planet on the boil, you're expecting a discussion on global warming. This is not that panel, but we will discuss it amongst others. This is actually the Avengers panel. I'm not sure there's such a big panel at JLF otherwise, with quite so many speakers, 6 panelists in all. It's a little more like one of our television shows, you know, with all the windows. But they will not be speaking over each other and at the same time. So what are we discussing? We are discussing the word polycrisis. The state of the world we're living in right now, which never has seemed more dire. You know, in 2008, when the world dealt with the great banking collapse and the sentiments of anti-globalization, there was a sense that there were troubled times in the world. But now, what we've seen is year on year, you begin the year literally with a new crisis, a new conflict that makes us all really worry about the future. There are those who have now suggested that after New Year's Eve, we should get at least, a month off from, all the world's crises and start the year a month later. But the truth is, this is also on us. It's not just crises that are happening randomly in the world. It's what we are doing about them. And so the guests we have today are really well equipped to talk about what they think their governments or the institutions they represent have really done about it. We also live in a time when, and this is not a sexist statement, it's about humans, not men. We live in a time when governments behave like men, while men continue to behave like men. And that basically means that governments are irrational. They're open to getting angry. They're open to wreaking revenge. They're open to doing things that states were supposed to be above. States were not supposed to attack in retaliation. They were supposed to ensure justice for all. We're living in a time where I can at least talk about 3 types of crises. The first, of course, is all the conflicts we're looking at, whether it was Russia's invasion of Ukraine, whether it was the Israeli bombardment of Gaza after the terror attacks in Israel, whether it's been closer home, the Taliban takeover of Afghanistan, whether it's been the Myanmar junta's takeover of its government. The fact is, the world order doesn't seem to be able to even turn the needle on any one of these crises. The second type of crisis, if we're talking about polycrisis in the world, I would say are those other issues. India, as someone who wanted to talk about the global south last year, said, well, what about the rest of the world that's worried about climate change, the changing weather, what it means for crops, food security, energy security, what it means in terms of the inequalities between people, digital inequalities. Those kind of issues get put by the wayside, but they are crises, and they do show up when you least expect them, when an island suddenly goes underwater or a typhoon takes away thousands of lives. And finally, we have the crisis of democracy. Around the world, democratic countries are democracies in terms of function, perhaps, in terms of holding an election, but there's no day after democracy. That means the day after elections, we are turning into more and more authoritarian states. And this is not just me saying it. International indices have talked about at least 20 to 40 in various stages of transition from democracy to authoritarian states. Populist leaders around the world are now more protectionist, they're xenophobic, they're anti-immigration, and more of those leaders have been elected in the past decade and a half across the world. Okay, so this is a really grim picture, which is why we need the Avengers on our panel today, hopefully to explain some of the choices, but also to perhaps give us some hope. Shyam, Saran, I want to start with you. And I want to ask you, of all these many challenges I've spoken about, what do you think is the world's biggest challenge in 2024? And what do you think is the most resolvable challenge in the world?
Well, it should come as no surprise to you that what I believe is perhaps the overweening challenge that we face today. And many of the things that you talked about are perhaps in some way or the other linked to that, which is the world's ecological crisis. Many of the things that you spoke about, if you look at the consequences of climate change and the ecological degradation which we are seeing, many of the problems that we are talking about will pale into insignificance if we have to face that bigger challenge. I think that is the kind of realization which is perhaps not really apparent to the world. So that is one thing. The second point is that, in a longer term perspective, what you are seeing today as a very grim situation, actually the world has seen through history perhaps even more grim situations.
Okay, that's a really, really grim response.
I mean, we had in the last century 2 world wars. You had a Holocaust. You had, colonized countries like India and others who were subjected to tremendous deprivation, oppression. So if I'm looking at a somewhat longer perspective of history, yes, we are facing a very grim situation, but it's not as if this is something unprecedented. And therefore, if we were able to live through those grim situations, I see no reason why we cannot live through and perhaps succeed through this grim situation. And thirdly, more practical. I think what we are seeing today is a change that is taking place in geopolitical equations. And in a very simple terms, you have China, which has declared victory too early, and you have had the United States, which has woken up too late to what it considers a threat. And in that, we are not able to find some kind of an equilibrium. And many of us, many of the states which are looking at that confrontation and possible engagement do not quite know where can we locate ourselves. So that's, from the point of view of India, I think that is the dilemma. Where do we locate ourselves in this very, very rapidly changing situation? And lastly, technology. Yes. What is technology going to do to us? Because the rate at which it is advancing, I think the ability to adjust to these changes. We have a digital revolution taking place, but we are still trying to deal with that with analog minds. How do we bring that about? That's it. Yeah.
All right, very important challenges that you set over there. Am I correct in thinking that you are suggesting that US-China rivalry is now the biggest geopolitical challenge of the next decade or so?
I have no doubt that it is going to be one of the defining challenges. I would be reluctant to say that that is the only relationship which matters, but it is certainly a relationship which has the potential of really sort of impacting on various other and even our ability to resolve many of the other challenges which you're talking about. How can you deal with, say, climate change if the US and China don't work? Right. How do you deal with artificial intelligence if the United States and China do not at least agree on some minimal rules of the game? I think that's...
Or even show up in a name, if nothing else, at the COP28 climate conference. That brings us to you, Ambassador Garcetti, and to where the US really is, because nobody believes Pax Sinica is here. But everyone does talk about Pax America on the decline. The idea that the US has consciously chosen to disappear from spaces it used to be. Yes, it has come into the Indo-Pacific. But will that Indo-Pacific last as long as the US has to deal with 2 other crises in the world, which is what we've seen in the last year? We also see the question of double standards, and I'm going to say specifically on this forum here at JLF, 2 days ago, we had the Indian former G20 Sherpa say very clearly, he was responding to your comments on Indian protectionism, and said that the US has grown purely on protectionism, that the US expects the rest of the world to adhere to climate change norms and climate change emissions cuts that it has never admitted to itself. So there is a sense that the US is not leading us right now. And there is this big threat that Ambassador Saran referred to. Do you see in the next decade the US's task, as it were, getting tougher?
So a lot of things in that question. Great to be with everybody. I think, I talked to somebody recently who said in the last 50 years, whenever you're on a panel as an American, the question's going to be, is America on the decline? And I think robustly, it's the strongest growing economy in the developed world, here with the strongest growing economy in the developing world. I think President Biden has very clearly engaged and re-engaged in the world and shown that we cannot just do that in one place at a time. Together with our European counterparts, really reviving the idea of alliances mattering and deepening our Indo-Pacific engagement to the highest level we've ever had, specifically with India in particular. My background is in climate work before I became a diplomat. And one thing I'd like to say is never judge a country, whether it's India, whether it's the United States or any of the countries up here, by just who's in charge at the very top. Countries are also nations, groups of people writ large that take actions every single day, their personal behaviors, their companies' behaviors, their communities' behaviors, the architecture and work of the systems of their cities and states. And I think it's at that level, as we come back to the kind of topic at hand of climate, that the work remains. So to quickly answer your question, then move on to the meat of that, of course America is deeply engaged at every level, whether it's at the subnational level, the corporate level, the international level, a special envoy for climate who is a former Secretary of State. I don't think anybody can doubt the primacy that we've put on this, also passing some of the strongest measures in human history, if not the strongest piece of legislation ever, to deal with doing the things we have to do to meet our targets. But when I went to COP28, I was leading a group of 100 of the largest cities of the world. It was actually the first time I had met Prime Minister Modi. I went on stage just after him as one of 3 non-national leaders that first day. And on behalf of the cities of the world, we made a pledge to get to carbon neutrality. And if you added up the economies of just those 100 largest cities of the world, it was the equivalent of the 5th largest country in the world. Now, I'll say this with the United States, with India, with everybody else. We all brag about how far we are, but the honest thing is there's one country that's truly on track to meet its commitments from Paris. One country, Denmark. The rest are not on track to meet that. But when you look at cities,
We tend to think we are.
Sorry?
We tend to think we are, but then we keep our ambitions a bit low.
It depends where you put your ambitions, but at least the general Paris ones of where we all needed to be. We can always set goals and surpass them easily. But cities, 2/3 of them are ahead of or on track to meet those goals. Again, the equivalent of the 5th largest city. And cities are complicated. Cities are where pollution occurs. Cities are where electricity systems reside. Building codes are. It's the places where transportation networks live. So I hope we can be inspired to not always just look at the tons of carbon, the national policies, the international agreements, but commit as human beings, because human beings are, after all, stubborn and innovative. We want to survive, and we're very creative about our survival, to look at our ability, and I think the United States is very engaged at that level, something I hope to do more here in India between American and Indian cities and states and regions to be able to achieve those breakthroughs that we need to achieve the goals that will save our lives.
All right, and to the specific accusation that the US has double standards on dealing with all of these.
Oh, I think it's easy to find any country where you can point out contradictions. I don't think we have double standards at this moment. And I would say to my Indian friends, and Amitabh is a dear, dear friend, we've talked since that, he said that's not all what I was saying. Don't do it for us, nor should America be saying do it for us. Do it for India because you're Indians. Do it for America because you're Americans. Do it for Germany because you're Germans. And just because we know things now we didn't know during the Industrial Revolution is not an excuse not to accelerate, because you will strangle yourself if you don't do them, not just not fulfill the wishes of an outside country.
Well, I have to say the climate is listening to that hopeful note, because it does seem like the rain has stopped and the sun is coming out. But don't put the mic down straight away. I do have one more question, which is you spoke about America getting in, increasing its commitment in all these spheres. Yet you're also heading into an election this year. One of the challengers, some may say the possible winner, is Donald Trump. The last time he came to power, America walked out of the JCPOA agreement with Iran. It walked out of the UNFCCC on climate change. It walked out of UNESCO. It walked out of the Human Rights Council. It walked out of a number of commitments it had made to countries like India on climate change financing. Given that you do have this election this year, how confident are you that America will walk that path that you've just described?
So I'm a diplomat now. I can't get as partisan as I once was. But I'll say this. When I was mayor of Los Angeles, the day that Donald Trump said he was going to withdraw from the Paris Accords, I had founded a group called Climate Mayors with a group of Democratic, Republican, and independent mayors across the United States. I got on the phone, and the membership of that organization went from about 15 to 30 overnight, from 30 to about 100 within a week, from 100 to over 500 within a month. And in some ways, it accelerated greater action inside the United States. And the lesson is, don't cede the power you have before you exercise it. No one man or woman who leads any nation can stop you from confronting this crisis. It is not just about the agreements that we make. It is about the actions we take where we live, the places we pray, the places that we work, the places that we study, the places that we convene. And we are powerful, and no one can take that away. No election can take that away from us.
All right, and I do take your point that a country is not just about who its current government is. It is about a nation of people. Ambassador Ackermann, I'm going to bring you in not only to speak as ambassador of Germany to India, but also a representative of the European Union in a sense. We looked at kind of a mirror image happen between last year and this year. The Ukraine war began, Russia's invasion of Ukraine began. Germany was at the forefront of nations coming to Delhi and saying, you have to take a stand here. The world must act to isolate Russia, to put Russia in a corner, to make sure the international rules-based order is followed. We look at the world after October 7th. For 3 or 4 months now, we have seen Israel say, we will not stop bombardment. We will try to save civilians, but if civilians die, so be it. We will bomb hospitals. We will not listen to the world and the United Nations and all the other agreements that talked about a two-state solution, because now we look at a one-state solution. We have ministers in the Israeli cabinet speak openly about the idea of ethnocide and clearing out populations from disputed territories. And we see the reaction of Europe, and we see the reaction of course, you know, the Western world. Japan is included in that. Completely silent. The exact same people who were vetoing resolutions against Russia last year, which is basically Russia, but with a little support from others, it got completely reversed at the UN Security Council. Suddenly we're looking at exactly the opposite. And the resolutions against Israel that are being vetoed are actually coming, that support is coming from the West. The United Nations General Assembly, which one would say was a representative of the world, has voted again and again. They voted in large numbers to criticize Russia on the invasion in Ukraine. They voted in large numbers to criticize Israel about the killing of civilians, the killing of UN officials, the killing of journalists. And yet, the global order seems to have, or the leadership of the global order seems to have different opinions. How do you explain that kind of polarization and double standard going into these conflicts, actually producing any kind of a standard for the world?
Okay, Suhasini, I would have hoped that you asked me about hope and confidence, but no, I have to go.
You can always answer with hope and confidence.
to the crisis. Now, let me say a word or two on these two scenarios you just described. First of all, I think I would say for Europe in the midterm and maybe also long-term run, the Russia problem is our most urgent problem, because the Russia problem is about our own security. And that's why Europe has to behave, and Europe has to try to get its act together in order to face that, in order to answer that in an appropriate way. And I think, in brackets, maybe a little glimpse of hope here. We are not so bad in getting our act together when it comes to our own security. But maybe we can talk about that later. Now, when it comes to the Israel conflict, first of all, I think you said it at the beginning, like Ukraine, Israel was attacked on the 7th of October by a terrorist attack. I think there is no doubt about it. And my country, who has a very difficult history with its Jewish people and Jewish people around Europe, has made it very clear that we stand by Israel after this attack. But, and I have to say that very clearly, the reaction to what happened on 7th of October causes distress and pain also in my government. And I'm sure you have seen what my minister said today. She was extremely clear when she said the plans of attacking Rafah in the south of Gaza are completely wrong and counterproductive.
Just to give the context, Rafah is to the south of Gaza, where actually Israel had said that the millions that moved from the north should actually take shelter while they bomb the north.
We have great difficulties to understand the Israeli tactics right now, and we have said from the very beginning that you should think about the day after this war, and there is basically in our minds only one solution, and that solution is called two-state solution. We have said that from the very beginning. There is no doubt about it. And frankly, most of our European partners have said the same. So I am with you when you say Germany has been very strongly siding with Israel after the attacks, but we have expressed our concerns when it comes to what happens right now. And I think we have to, this is basically when you have diplomatic crises, you have to, that's our job, diplomats, we are not always good at it, but we have to think ahead. I mean, what will happen after that? And now let me come to the hope part, I'm sorry. But I think there is an old diplomatic saying that reads, never waste a crisis. I think crises are a stimulus for solutions also. And let me give you 2 or 3 examples. One, Europe, very difficult, 27 extremely difficult different countries, with own agendas, have really find their way together when it comes to Ukraine. You have recently seen last week the European Summit has again has gathered a lot of money for Ukraine, to support Ukraine to survive. We have been in the alliance, and that's now the Russian threat that Europe really feels right now. The Russian threat has caused a new rejuvenating of an alliance that one European president has called brain dead a couple of years ago, and who's now all of a sudden very important, NATO. And NATO has, has got through this crisis a new, like a boost. And I think we have all, realized how important this alliance is. And I would say that that is all pretty positive. And what Saran said about the ecological crisis, which I would completely agree with, this is why are we so under stress? There are certainly several reasons for that, but climate change is one of the biggest reasons. Now, I would say it's only to be fought in alliances. You can't do it without alliances. And China must be part of this alliance somehow. I mean, whether you might like their politics or not, but without China, without India, this is just fruitless. And we have to do our very best to get together in these alliances. It's a difficult process. I think we have come step by step. You see what happened in COP Abu Dhabi was maybe not the best offer, but it was not so bad at the end of the day, and I think there is a big willingness worldwide to try to
keep the consensus process going. Ambassador Stener, you're from Norway, which has taken a different position on Israel, but I want to ask you really about how you see conflicts changing the way the world builds these coalitions. For example, the Nordic countries have started to take a separate path, not just on climate change, on global supply chains, on energy routes, than even the rest of Europe. Do you think that that's sub-regionalism is now the way forward, or are people, I think the author Bruno Massais, who's been on JLF quite a lot, spoke about it as tribalism. That as the world goes into more crises, I remember External Affairs Minister Jaishankar, just as the Russian invasion of Ukraine had begun, they were in Australia, and he was asked about what India would say at the Quad about the invasion. And he said, last I looked, Russia is not in the Indo-Pacific. So the idea that each of us is looking much more about our region is in trouble, we have to deal with this, other people have to deal with others. Do you think sub-regionalism is going to be the way forward?
Thank you so much, and good afternoon, everyone. Definitely not. I don't think sub-regionalism is going to be the way forward. I think the world is interlinked, and we see that as a result of these crises. Ukraine was one of the largest grain producers. It's a grain crisis that is affecting Africa, Asia, all of us. Palestine is affecting, or the crisis there is affecting first and foremost the Palestinian people, but regional implication in the Red Sea, and that is also affecting all of us. I was myself in Svalbard, up in the Arctic last year with Indian Minister of Earth Sciences, talking to Indian researchers up there, finding the linkages between ice melting in the Arctic and monsoons and overheating here in India. This is how it's interlinked, and that is why we have to work together. We are part of several regional blocks. You mentioned the Nordic bloc. We are a few small countries having also our own organization, but it is as old as the UN, and we've been working together with the United Nations, and that has been the backbone of what we have been doing in the Nordic region anyway. The Arctic Council, consisting of the eight countries who are bordering the Arctic, that has been a good regional organization where we can talk even with Russia in these days. Although we stopped the cooperation for a while, we took, as Norway, over the chairmanship from Russia, and we are carrying forward in a different way, but still the cooperation, because it's needed. And this is just a part of the bigger global cooperations that we need to have, because all the crises are interlinked.
All right, but even so, I do have to put that same question to you. You know, Norway has often shown itself as the leader of the world when it comes to moving transition to renewable energy and to bring down emissions and all the rest. And yet, in the wake of the Ukraine crisis, Norway is pumping out more oil. In another respect, Norway has, and the parliament has agreed to mining critical minerals in a way that could also affect the environment, could affect the marine environment. Do you think there is that double standard?
I can understand why you're asking the question. And, you know, we also need to try and keep a couple of thoughts in our heads at the same time. The reinforcement after Russia invaded Ukraine of our delivery of energy to the rest of Europe was a part of that crisis. And it was a result of that. And it will also, in the longer term, help the whole of Europe for the energy transition. And we want to be part of that. Also looking at the seabed, and we have decided now to look at the seabed mineral in part of Norway, but with caution. And we are aware that we don't have enough knowledge yet of that. And it's only when we get that knowledge and when we know if it has an effect that we will actually start mining there. It's not. We have not decided to mine.
All right. I do have one small question for you on the issue of the Russian invasion of Ukraine. The way Europe reacted was to walk back on a lot of the globalization outcomes that we had seen. The way the Western world cut off trade with Russia, cut off credit agencies with Russia, cut off travel with Russia, cut off flights, overflights, cut off cultural ties. You know, here in India, we often used to get a lot of lectures on behaving better with our neighbors, of, keeping a lot of these ties going. And yet we suddenly saw the world almost cleave down the top. Do you think part of the crisis is we've become very much about our side or the other side? And there hasn't been a way of bringing them together.
No, I don't think so. Just also to reiterate what my German colleague said, this is our neighborhood. Norway is neighboring Russia. We are a small country. It's a big country invading another neighbor. And it's, of course, existential for us. Like, your conflicts in this neighborhood are existential for India. That does not mean that we are not also looking at the bigger picture and want to be a player also on the whole world stage.
Okay, Ambassador Ajay Bisaria, I want to come to you about India's double standards and the idea that we talk about peace in the world. We talk about being Vishwa Gurus. We talk about global stabilizers and bringing these, age-old civilizational values to the world. Yet we live in a neighborhood where our two biggest enemies and our two biggest rivals are nuclear-powered, nuclear-armed countries, China and Pakistan. We don't seem to be able to make a go with either of them, and yet we want to show the world how to go for peace.
So I think our ambitions are really defined by the world we live in. So when we step back and look at it, and Ambassador Saran spoke about it, we see a world in geostrategic terms where there are major contestations going on. It's a world between orders, it's a world in flux, it's a chaotic world. And what we are seeing in terms of contestation today is China defying the United States and the larger West, Russia defying the larger West, and in a sense, Iran defying the larger West in West Asia. So these are three conflicts and contestations, and we need to
You're
figure...
correcting me. There's actually 4 nuclear-armed neighbors in the region.
Absolutely. And of course, I should add the 4th contestation which impacts us, which is the one between the Democrats and Republicans in the United States. So, but now sticking to the 3, where do we locate ourselves in? Clearly, I think on the China contestation, we are an interested party. We take sides. Because here we have a belligerent, revisionist neighbor, a belligerent rise of a country which is challenging the #1 country in the world. And therefore, we take sides in multiple ways, whether it expresses itself in Quad or making a larger alliance of democratic parties, democratic countries, and so on. But again, on the other 2, I feel that India has the equities on both sides, not just to be neutral, but to be able to play the peacemaker in both these other conflicts in a calibrated way when the occasion arises. Now, coming back to our neighborhood in your question, I think we stay in a tough neighborhood. And so we have, to the north, a tough revisionist, expansionist neighbor. To the west, we have a tough revisionist, irritating neighbor, which is not worried about deploying terrorism. And therefore, our dealing with this tough neighborhood is defined by dealing with this army-run state and this party-run state, which are sui generis, which are sort of different states. And we need to have crafted policies focused on these countries. So we continue to be neighborhood first, but we need to have a special set of policies for these 2 tough neighbors. And I think our ambitions of being Vishwa Guru are now down to being Vishwa Mitra. We are the friend of the world, and we ought to be using those equities, I think, in doing a peacemaking role. But if we have tough neighbors, we need to be tough with them.
All right, tough neighbors require tough responses. But can I ask also about the question of how these populist governments around the world now look at domestic policy as their foreign policy? In other words, their foreign policy becomes a part of political campaigns within the country. And their domestic policy tends to overshadow our relations with other countries. You've been in Canada, apart from, of course, Pakistan, which you wrote the book, Anger Management, about. And you have seen the impact of India's domestic politics, protests in India, playing out in our relationship with Canada. Do you think at some level, India can say whatever it likes, but people will watch how India walks the talk rather than the talk it actually gives out to the world?
I think it's always been the case that foreign policy is an expression of national interest. And in democracies, you take into account popular opinion, public opinion. Now, I think statesmanship is about crafting national interests, balancing that public opinion rather than being completely guided by that opinion. And I think that balance, you might argue that we've shifted one way or the other, but that is what each country needs to do. And you mentioned the Canada case. I think the United States handled it completely differently from the way Canada handled it. It was dealt with as a security problem. In Canada, it became a sort of political issue. So I think
two countries' domestic politics playing out as foreign policy.
Absolutely.
All right, that's certainly an interesting take on that. And Shombi Sharp, I've saved you for the last. You've been here long enough, so you are aware of our great mythological works in India, and Mahabharata is one of them. And the United Nations has begun to resemble Dhritarashtra, the blind father of the Kauravas who watches as the world is going to cede, as the sons and the nephews are fighting with each other, where there is absolutely no give or take even over a small inch of land. And yet the United Nations just lurches from crisis to crisis. There's the COVID pandemic. People around the world die. China is never held to account for not telling the world earlier about the pandemic and how to deal with it. Western countries are not held to account for holding on to all their resources. Nobody is held to account for the way they dealt with the pandemic in their own countries. The United Nations wasn't even really able to bring together the world to agree on something simple. Of course, I was at the WTO on doing away with all the special patents and restrictions when it came to COVID medicine and ensuring that everyone could produce that COVID medicine. So I'm just using one example. I've already spoken about all these other crises where the UN seems to pass statements. The UN Secretary General says Gaza is a graveyard for children. And yet, nobody is able to stop the bombardment of children over there. And I'm talking about the most recent case of a crisis where the UN just seems to be very powerless. Finally, it seems to be completely powerless in reforming itself. You know, physician, heal thyself, but it doesn't seem as if the UN is ready for that kind of reform. How do you react to this great responsibility that the UN was given 100 years ago, or nearly 100 years ago? We said never again. We said so many other things about a global world order. And honestly, in 2024, we're wondering what's going to follow the UN by 2045.
Well, thank you. So, right, the last but not least, that's quite a mouthful question there. But first of all, mujhe JLF mein aakar bahut khushi hui. Always need to say that. I think that what we've been hearing is argument for more UN, not less UN. And to invoke the famous quote from Madeleine Albright, right? The UN needs to reform. The UN is reforming. And if we didn't have it, we would just need to invent it. So, you know, we're looking at, we just had the hottest year on record in maybe 100,000 years. We have wars in all over the place. We have pandemics, these sorts of things. And yet, I would also, we look at the Sustainable Development Goals, the SDGs, you know, they're terribly off track. Only 15% sort of on track, this kind of a thing. And everyone is talking about alliances and working together and common challenges and common responses. Now here I would say, actually I would push back a little bit. The UN is doing a huge amount of good in the world. I mean, the UN is protecting 117 million people forced out of their homes from conflict, from climate, providing vaccinations for 45% of the world's children, you know, these sorts of things. So a little bit sort of, as Eric mentioned, don't look at just the top, the president of a country or something. You know, we can't just look at the Security Council. That's not the whole UN. And in fact, there's so much else there. But the Secretary General does say, look, we need reform. No one wants reform of especially the Peace and Security Council more than the staff of the UN, the SG on down. He says, how can we have an organization delivering a future for our grandchildren that was designed for our grandparents? So there's no doubt about that, right? But as Shakespeare said, you know, the world is a stage. And I think Shashi Tharoor is the one that I first heard say, the UN is both an actor and a stage. It's a stage for the member states to come together and to deliver things like the COP process, like the High Seas Treaty, like plastic ban that's coming. So many important developments are happening. But those member states have to agree on peace and security, and when they do, then the UN becomes an actor. Then the UN steps in. We see, you know, peacekeeping missions across the world. There's so many also very important examples of that. So that's really a complexity that we really have to keep in mind.
Do you see UN reform having moved even an inch in terms of the expansion of the Security Council? It's a question you'll hear much about in India. Do you see the needle having moved at all?
It's a very interesting question. Yes and no. But there's a process been underway. Working groups have been set up for about 15 years. It hasn't yet gotten to that formalized stage. But what I would say to, there is a risk that we lose, especially we look at the P5. Again, it's member states' decisions, that we lose some space in this world to the what's are sometimes called mini-laterals, right? So you've seen actually in the last year, and India has been very much at the forefront of some of these processes. You see the G20 expanding. African Union was brought in by India's leadership. You see BRICS expanding. You see, so some of this perceived vacuum, this space is being filled. So I think what we as an institution are hoping is that we can get agreement, especially in the Security Council, that there is more to gain by expanding and reforming than there is to lose. And India's leadership in this space as well, I would just note in terms of climate action, right? Something happened, the world changed between COP26 and COP27. Ukraine war has been mentioned. And for the wrong reasons, unfortunately, we saw a more honest debate that high-income countries started to fire up some coal power, right? Because it's a crisis. Well, the developing world, and India's leading voice, said, look, your crisis is our regular reality. You look at India. Two-thirds of India's cities have not yet been built. It's, Minister Hardipuri talks about India will need to add a Chicago every sort of 2 years or something like that. How do you do that on the basis of the right to development, climate action, climate justice?
All right. Certainly an interesting panel over here. I've asked the organizers, since we started late due to the rain, if we could take just a few questions. I see a lot of hands up. And I'm going to go to the lady in the fourth row, I think. Just ask your question. Just ask a very quick question.
Yes, so my question is tilted towards climate crisis. Are people losing trust with COP? I mean, people lost already their hopes from Paris Agreement, now yearly COPs. Campaigners are upset. So, I mean, people and government both needs to be motivated in order to meet targets. It's like every country is on their own. So that's my question.
All right. And I'm going to take just two more. So go ahead. Just give it to the gentleman here. To the left.
Hello. So as a country, as a world, we are facing multiple crises right now. There's the climate, there are the wars. So, and the most popular solution that has been given by this panel is that we should come together. So my question is there any other solution that can be proposed to the world that can be a more, I don't want to say efficient, but as another solution?
Basically, elect one country the leader of the world and let them do whatever they want. And there's one lady right at the edge, and we'll end it there. Right there.
Hello, everyone. So my question for the panel is, with all the polycrises happening around in the world, and the superpowers such as China and America being involved among themselves, how is the undermining authoritative nature of UN in solving the crisis be solved? Because even though there are crises happening around the world, and even though ceasefire was ordered, a humanitarian ceasefire was ordered, but no action was taken under them. So people are kind of losing their faith in the authoritative nature of UN. So what are the superpowers, such as America, China, India, European Union, doing about it? Like how to solve that problem so that we can reinstate our faith in the UN as being a guarding body?
All right, three quick questions. I'm going to get them to some of our panel. Ambassador Garcetti, do you want to take on the question of whether the US-China rivalry is really wrecking things for the rest of the world? And can US and China actually get together?
Well, certainly we hope not, and we're engaging with China, which is in everybody's interest, especially around climate, which is one of the areas we've kept alive. But, this is not that the world order is crumbling, it's that principles matter. The difference between what India, we can get caught up in the narcissism of small differences between democracies, important questions about the critics of whether we're declining democracies or not, or we can see the radically different systems which are juxtaposed against us, using technology against us, we're trying to rewrite rules even when we don't all abide by them perfectly from yesterday. But we need to look at those stark differences. And to the question, what's changing in the world, don't get locked in by your International Relations 101 course. This is not always just about the United Nations, which is a forum as much as it is an organization. It's not just about national governments. Again, I'd come back to that same point. We are powerful where we live and where we are. And there's a great Hindi proverb, Jab jago tab savera. Who cares when you wake up? But when you wake up, that is the beginning of the day. So let us wake up and take action in all aspects, wherever we are. Yes, UN needs reforming, but don't wait for the UN to reform to do something today.
All right, Ambassador Ackermann, do you think there's climate fatigue in the world? Or COP fatigue, as she pointed out?
So I would say there is certainly not COP fatigue, but COP is not living up to people's expectations. We have to accept that, acknowledge that. But the question is, what is the alternative? And I think, I'm feeling for poor Shombi here. You overburden this UN. The UN is what it is. It's the ensemble of its member states. It's not a supranational organization. Neither is COP. You have to sit together and try to find solutions. Now, truth is, not always the best solutions come out of this, but what we have seen is that the solutions improve, or the progress improves, and therefore I think COP is one of the biggest hopes we have. And to your question, whether what is the alternatives to alliances or joining hands, I'm of the opinion there is no alternative. Every country should be a Vaishwamitar, and you should at the end of the day try to do the best and fight for solutions to problems that concern all of us.
Did you want to add to that, Ambassador Stener? Go ahead.
I just want to reiterate those points. Firstly, we must not lose hope. And we do actually agree on several things that also can make us not lose hope. And there is no alternative to coming together. We must come together.
No alternative to the UN as well?
Nations.
No alternative to the United Nations? Because that was the question, who should lead?
We must come together in a as United Nations, but we must also come together with civil society and business and the whole.
All right. Thank you very much. It was a tough order for our panel today to solve the world's problems in such a short time. But thank you, and you've been a great audience, so I'll just hand it over to you.
Thank you so much.